usually puts in a video of the conversation. So we're recording this, but if anyone has objections to this going on YouTube, please email me afterwards. Amazing. Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining. We'll likely have a few more folks trickle in, but we wanted to just get started. My name is Meda, and I've been working on risk and reliability measurement space for agents in multiple capacities. Previously at McKinsey, I'm also involved with ML Commons, and all the folks on this call are amazing, amazing people I've had the opportunity to collaborate with in different ways. And so thank you so much for joining. I want to share a little bit of context on why this was also a request that came in from the startup community, as well as from the banks, fintechs that we've been in touch with through multiple channels. And the reason behind this is sort of multiple fold. One is, specifically within banks, but also broadly within financial services, we've for decades known how to measure risk in multiple ways. Model takes inputs, produces an output. We know how to validate it, backtest it, benchmark it, monitor it, et cetera, et cetera. But a few things have changed in the recent past. One is just the idea of what a unit of risk is that has changed. And that isn't, an agent isn't a model. It is a model which is embedded in a loop of tools, harness, environment, et cetera. And so just the idea of model evaluation doesn't work anymore. So that unit of risk has changed. The failure modes have changed. So, initially the understanding was that if there is an adversary, then there could potentially be a misuse. But today, an agent can be uncompromised inside its permissions, but there can still be, instructions carrying poisoned memory forward, and several other failure modes for which we don't even have a very defined risk taxonomy just yet. And Mike and I have been working on this on the side, so we're happy to talk a little bit about that separately as well. The yardstick has changed in the sense that there isn't reproducibility of agent outcomes in multiple ways. And the regulatory guidance has changed in the sense that specifically in banks, SR 11.7 doesn't, completely take into account agent governance anymore. But also beyond regulated industries, there isn't a clear sense of what that looks like. And so we wanted to have this conversation from multiple perspectives, which is why we have Mike Su, Jason Stanley, and Boran joining us. So I'll do a quick intro of their amazing backgrounds, but if you did log in via Key, you would be able to see everything else that they have done in the past that I might not be able to talk about. And so Mike used to serve previously as acting controller of currency from May 2021 to Feb 25. And during that time, he was the administrator of the federal banking system and the CEO of the Office of Controller of Currency. He also served as the director of FDIC, a member of Financial Stability Oversight Council, and the chair of Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council. And during the global financial crisis, he worked at the Treasury Department, followed by a stint at IMF. He's a fellow at Aspen, Bretton Woods Committee, and is advising amazing startups, fintechs, organizations that are at the forefront of agent deployments today. Jason is the head of applied AI research at ServiceNow, where he's leading a team that is de-risking AI research discoveries, including in the areas of AI evaluation, security, safety, trustworthy agent architectures. Previously, he led the company's applied research team working on AI trust and governance. And in the past, he's led research and product teams in technology companies, and was invited as an expert on AI issues to serve at the OECD. He holds a PhD in sociology from NYU and social science degrees from Oxford University. And he has an amazing blog that I would recommend everyone to go read, because I learn a lot from that as well. And then Boran is an applied ML scientist at TD Bank. He conducts technical reviews of banks' AI systems and contributes to the consumer protection requirements that they're held to. Previously, he audited AI systems for harm as a senior consultant at Babel, and he helped lead AI Risk and Vulnerability Alliance, where he directed its research partnership with Data and Society. His research examines the building blocks of AI risk management, how AI should be evaluated, red team, and the goals of AI research itself. And his work has appeared in multiple AI research communities, including ICML, FACT, etc. And so thank you so much for joining. And I feel like this is a very interestingly diverse group, which is kind of brings multiple perspectives. My initial plan was to start broad, but I was reflecting on it, and I realized that maybe we start on a more specific questions that we had, because we'll get to better answers. So, Mike, I want to start with you. You've signed multiple, regulatory policy guidance in the past, and we know that SR 26.2 puts Gen AI, agentic outside of the model risk management and says that, banks' general governance should fill the gap. So in your conversations with banks, how are they responding to it or thinking to it? And then also from your point of view, how they should think about Gen AI and agentic governance.
So I'll maybe start this off, Meta, by like a quick story from a year ago. So about a year ago, I had 3 different conversations with 3 different banks in 1 week. And we were talking about AI adoption. And I was really curious as to which group or groups are responsible for the AI, like kind of overseeing the AI adoption. And this is kind of pre-coding agents. But one bank said, oh, it's under model risk management, right? They're the primary keepers. Another bank said, oh, it's actually under our TPRM because it's a third party. It's like a third party product that we buy. And another group said, oh, it's under our SDLC, our software development lifecycle, because we just treat it as software. They were all talking about the exact same thing. And so it really struck me that this thing that is what we call AI can actually fit kind of under a bunch of different existing frameworks. But everyone admitted, okay, we have to shoehorn it. We got to adjust it for this thing, which is not deterministic, blah, 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 blah. And then that starts to converge a bit. The shape of the thing is more or less similar, but the starting points are different. And those frameworks, I think it's good, actually, that the federal banking agencies freed it from model risk management. Because I think the model risk management in some ways provides a good starting point, but it's not fit for purpose for agents. And so there's a little bit of a dog caught the car. I think with the banks, they said, great, we don't want to be cabined by model risk management, which is very documentation heavy. But now the question is now what do we do? And I think that's a pretty open-ended question, actually. Conversations with you and some of the colleagues, I would have thought by now there'd be a lot of convergence, but there's not. And, it's a little bit personality dependent, like who's the smartest person on AI in the organization. They tend to have an outsized role, probably rightly so, but that places differently in different organizations, even for the same kind of application. So this is going to take some time, I think, to work through. And the regulators, for the most part, are staying pretty high level because I think they're recognizing that one size fits all doesn't really work right now.
And so I guess to your point on who's the sort of smartest person on AI in an organization sort of making that determination. So maybe I'll take that to the kind of technical oversight piece to you, Jason. There are a lot of conversations or research papers around, saying you don't have to fix an agent by training or retraining the model. You have to fix the harness. And make these rules explicit in terms of how an agent harness is developed and how it is audited, and and that becomes the more sort of deterministic interface, if I may, as opposed to the model. And so I guess I would love to understand, as you think about sort of technical breakdown of an agent, how should that evaluation be conducted, or how are you seeing that in sort of multiple clients that you serve at ServiceNow?
Yeah, okay, good question. So I'm not sure how many people are really familiar with these terms like agent, harness, control plane. It might be worth just going briefly over what we tend to mean by these things. So model is something that people are quite familiar with. We refer to this in the models, the generative AI models, the LLMs of today are different from the classic machine learning models, but effectively we're still talking about like a set of weights. The model is represented by a set of weights. A harness around this, now we typically use that to refer to the various bits and pieces that we bolt on the outside of a model but still in the system to make sure that that system works better, is more reliable, and so on and so forth. So when you're interacting, for example, with ChatGPT or Claude, even if you're only interacting with the chat version, you're not really interacting with just the model. There's a whole harness built around this, right? There's memory, there's an orchestrator. That orchestration loop may, require the model to reason in a very particular way, to reason iteratively over multiple steps, to go out, get stuff, reason over what comes back, and then go back out and search for more. Effectively, these kind of loops. Tools are in there usually. The capacity to author new tools may be part of a harness. A learning loop may be part of a harness. Okay, so there's a bunch of pieces that you can bolt on the outside of a model to create an agent, or it doesn't necessarily have to be an agent. It could just be a system that's non-agentic, but nevertheless, it has these pieces around it. And then there's the environment that this thing is acting in. And the environment often consists also of what we might refer to as like a control plane. So this, you can think of this as like something distinct from the agent, distinct from the harness, but where you've got a set of monitors and controls and gates and doors and windows and so on that you're able to control in a distinct way from controlling the harness. And all of this together creates a profile of how an agent is able to and likely to act in the world. So, there's a lot of complexity I'm not going into there, but this is effectively like there's different pieces here. Thinking about evaluation as a model first thing is a really wrong approach to thinking about understanding the risk profile of an agent. In the same way that we would never try to understand the risk profile of a vehicle by testing an engine on its own. A vehicle is comprised of all these different parts. And yes, you want to do engine testing, but it's not going to tell you much about the profile of the risk of the vehicle. And then the vehicle in a very specific setting is going to be different than under the presence or absence of police and traffic lights and so on. Is all of these things ultimately are going to condition the risk profile. And so as much as possible, you want to be doing testing that reflects the environment that the thing is going to be deployed into. So the thing shouldn't just be the model, it should be what's being deployed. That's the whole harness and model and everything. It should be tested in an environment that looks as close as possible to the environment it's going to be deployed into under the conditions of variation. It should be kicked in different ways so that you're able to assess what's going to happen when it's put under stress. That could be adversarial stress, like the attacker situation. It could be non-adversarial stress, like when there's storms present, when there's ice on the road. Like the same way that we think of technologies need to be tested under a variety of circumstances, this is what testing and evaluation needs to look like for whole systems with harness present, thought of in the distribution of likely situations, adversarial, non-adversarial, that the system's going to be exposed to. So I'll stop there.
You bring a really interesting point, actually, which is like testing in multiple circumstances. Usually people think about testing on multiple risk types, but I think what you're talking about is combination of experiences that the agent might go through, which is a very interesting thought. Borhan, I would love to ask you a little bit more as sort of going from like sort of technical deployment to validation, specifically because you've done sort of the agent AI audit work in the past. As second line in banks, what is the effective challenge, in this agentic context, specifically to the nuanced evaluation that the first line has to do that Jason just described to us?
Yeah. So I also want to take a step back and just start with the core of the topic for me, right? We're talking about risk management, and we're talking about excellent risk management. To me, that's the thing where banking has unique strengths and unique opportunities. And in the spirit of excellent risk management, I have to start with a disclaimer. So today I'm speaking in my personal capacity. I don't speak for my employer, and everything I say is my own view. And also the examples that I'll be drawing from are going to be from public sources, things that have been published by others, work that I've done outside the bank, including partnership on AI working group on agentic AI monitoring that Jason is also a part of. All right, so risk management part. The first thing I want to say about the second line and effective challenge dynamic is just like signposting, a feature of what happens inside of banks that I think is really important to this conversation, but it's going to be crucial and interesting to keep revisiting the question of where is the stress actually being put. And Mike, you already raised this, right? This question of, like, and I really just love your post about this. Like, like the story you gave, I know you have the write-up about it, and it's been a really thought-provoking source for me as well. So this question of like, what do the functions look like? What's the function that should be doing effective challenge? All of that is going to be like something we keep going back to, but I want to start by thinking about the relationship first. So other thing, Jason, and Mike, you both publish on is thinking through the importance of trust engineering, right? So the question of, are your controls effective? Are they good enough? Are they doing what they're supposed to? Have you designed and engineered and tested your system components in a way that enables you to be confident that the system will remain within your risk parameters, right? Like that problem. It's really important engineering problem. The second thing about banking, and that brings me to the effective challenge piece, is that in a bank, you're doing risk management, you've got objectives, you've got uncertainty, and you want to make sure that your efforts remain within your risk appetite. That's what you're going for. There's a piece to this that is important to keep in mind about how banks work too, which is that you don't just accept that you've put in your efforts, and your efforts, must be good enough because you put in the time, right? You also want to internally check. So this question of, how do you know that your risk management, that your trust engineering is good? How do you know that? And inside of banks, you have functions whose responsibility it is to come in and provide an objective assessment of whether or not your efforts are actually good. You think they're good, but are you right? That's the effective challenge piece. There's two little, aspects of this that are important to have in mind. The first one is there needs to be some amount of objectivity. If you have the same perspective and the same incentives as the people you're checking, you might run into trouble. Maybe you're just going to repeat what was already said. You're going to think the same way. So there's going to be a need for some amount of distance. The question of what that looks like is going to be important, and it's something we might, come back to. But the second piece is there's got to be teeth to the checking. You don't just check. There's got to be consequences. And that's the other piece. Like, what does that look like? So what does this work look like inside of banks? I can't speak in general. I'm most familiar with functions that are, like model oversight style functions. I've worked in compliance setting and function that looks a lot like what fair banking can look like in the US when you do the model review piece of fair banking. I've also worked in like model risk management type functions. So I'm most familiar with that side of the coin. And the thing I'll say about what effective challenge looks like, and I just want to leave us off like there because it's going to be a conversation we keep having. It's important to distinguish between types of agents now. So agents, like Jason has started like laying the groundwork for like the topic of the conversation. I think it's important here to also signpost. There's a lot of things that get called agent, rightfully so, and not all of them are putting as much pressure on existing oversight functions as others. So for me, and I'm thinking about the Partnership on AI working group that Jason's also involved with. There's a white paper that's going to come out hopefully soon. We were having conversations about like what are like realistic case studies folks should be thinking about. And the thing that the group strongly agreed to fairly early on was the realistic case studies right now often look like fairly narrow purpose, where what you're trying to automate. The target of automation, the use case is clear. And then you're looking to use, some automation process that involves, LLM-powered nodes, that's going to carry out some amount of automation in a way that is well scoped, well defined. When you're dealing with highly scoped, narrow purpose problems where also you feel comfortable with the risk level. Maybe you feel comfortable with the fact that the process you're inserting is incremental. You're not radically disrupting your existing process. You're instead making some change that might speed up an existing process. So, Mida, you shared a Sardine white paper on anti-money laundering, right? What they're talking about in that setting is an agent being used for a very narrow purpose. You have a queue of alerts that's generated by business as usual process. It's not the agent generating all of the alerts, right? You've got your queue that you're supposed to work through as your anti-money laundering function. You need to check. You've got these alerts. You need to check, put in some time to vet. Are these alerts just mistakes? Weed out the false positives, right? So you've got these alerts. You need to narrow down your queue and then figure out where do I put my energy, and then figure out where do I start sending reports to the regulator, right? That's the kind of the shape of the problem. You're talking about using agents. So the Sardine paper that you shared is talking about using agents to speed up the, like shorten the queue, as it were. So like you're reading out false positive with your agent, right? For this kind of problem, there's testing you can specify that already exists and that we're already fairly familiar with, that does a fairly good job. There's going to be limitations. I'm not saying that everything can be tested, but there are things you can already do. You can already check the outcomes of the process. You can check the outcomes of the process at nodes. You can check the outcomes of the process against past records. You know how you've made decisions in the past, feed the same inputs to the system, see what it does. You can also adopt kind of like a controlled, like A/B testing style approach. It's sometimes in banking called champion challenger approaches, where you say you're going to route some amount of your cases through the system under evaluation. You're going to route some other amount of your cases through a business as usual process, and you're going to compare the two. So there's all these things you can already do, right? There's also going to be things that are slightly, maybe more novel and evolving with agents. Checking the process might be very expensive. You might not always want to go check how, what range of paths does the agent take at different nodes? What range of mistakes does the agent make when doing tool calls? Sometimes you're going to want to check that. Maybe you don't always care to check that. Maybe there's situations where you primarily are focused on outcomes. But the thing is that for very narrow purpose agents that are well scoped, there's existing, like testing, approaches you can think of taking. And when existing testing approaches work well, you might have existing functions that know how to do this, how to do the relevant kind of testing. So that's the thing to flag. The question then is, where's the frontier where there's genuine pressure as a function of the kind of agent we're talking about on your oversight infrastructure, on your effective challenge infrastructure? Where does that look like, really? Where is that being put under pressure? And then the second question is, what does your change management look like? How do you go from where you are right now to a place where your assurance capacity is fit for the kind of systems you're trying to engineer and deploy? Okay.
That was very, very nuanced and very helpful. I'm glad that we have meeting notes. I have to go revisit the entire structure that you laid out. I guess just to follow on to that, and maybe I'll open it up to the group on this, is you mentioned about this sort of base narrow use cases, which is where most banks are operating. A lot of fintechs payments are kind of way beyond that narrow scope, right? Because and there is a regulatory distinction. There are multiple other reasons for that. If we take a broader sense of financial services or regulated industries in that tiering, how is that tiering being done beyond the narrow to the next? Because I think you talked about 2 levels, so let's just break it down into multiple levels, and maybe that's a question for Jason as well, because I know, Jason, you've written about this as well. And at what tier is it actually breaking today for other industries? So I'll leave that as an open-ended question, and then maybe Jason, you can start, and others can talk about.
So just so I understand the question, the tiering, yeah, can you just
agent capability tiering?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess what I would say here is capability. I think the evaluations we tend to have in the ecosystem, and by ecosystem I mean in AI in general, not just in financial services. We're talking about deployments here. Evaluation in general is a pretty underdeveloped science. There's an awful lot of benchmarks being put out there, an awful lot of model cards demonstrating performance against reams and reams of these benchmarks. But there's also a lot of work being done to show all the holes that exist in these various benchmarks. Not just the fact that let's say it's 1,000 or 10,000 rows, and that doesn't obviously represent this really infinite number of possibilities. This has always been obvious, but even down to it turns out 20 to 30% of tasks in the benchmark actually have errors in them, and despite all the major labs running all their evals on these benchmarks all the time, no one seemed to notice the leakage, people having access to the answers to the test before the test is run. And there's so many problems with this. And the solutions to this are not obvious, but simply understanding what the capabilities of a system are is something we struggle with today, right? And I'd say this is particularly sharp at the deployment level where generic evaluations done on, I don't know, like, can you do well on a general math test are not the right kinds of evaluations. You should be doing evaluations that are very grounded in your deployment, on the type of tasks, on the data distribution you're expected to encounter. Those kinds of evaluations are really, really undercooked, often because the organizations consuming AI haven't yet caught up to the skills of machine learning and AI engineering, but beyond that, just risk-aware evaluation. And so we're like way behind just on capability and risk evaluation in general. So it's very difficult even to know how to think about risk tiering in a context or capability tiering where we actually don't have great evaluations to tell us exactly what the capability profile of an individual system is. So I'm a very big advocate of going back to basics, not trying to boil the ocean and make sure everything is perfect, but actually having organizations invest in evaluation science so that they're able to understand the capability, the risk, the appropriateness, and all of those things give you answers to what kind of control plane you should be designing. If you don't have those base answers to system evaluation, you're not going to have the raw materials you need to work with, understanding how to govern a system. And I would just come back. I think it's a nice neat little loop here. Come back to where we started around, like, is the so-called smartest person in the room, or the most knowledgeable person about AI, the right person to be listening to? And I think it's probably just we should caution against those kinds of. I mean, I realize it was a bit of a throwaway statement, but like it's a useful thing to engage with, because I see it frequently internally, like in conversations I'm in all over the place, where someone is looked to as being, the quote unquote like expert in generative AI because they know how to train a model or something like that, right? That is indeed a scarce skill set, but it is not at all the same kind of skill set as understanding how to do good materiality assessment. And then if you don't have that, well, then you don't know how to assess the right things, and you don't know how to like generate the kind of statistical tests necessary to understand tail risks. And so when you talk to someone who has like deep expertise in how to engineer a harness, it's so wildly different from the kind of expertise you need to understand how to do good risk assessment of generative AI systems. And so real big caution to not over-index on someone's, I don't know, like whether they've published at NeurIPS or whether they've trained the biggest model out there, because they very often don't have a great understanding of what it means to build a risk taxonomy that's grounded in a specific deployment, or to do great statistical testing of risks that come at the tail, because that's just not how AI evaluation is done. You can look at model cards and see it's usually done with generic benchmarks, and people can be great at doing that, but don't confuse these different kinds of expertise, I guess is what I would say.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think for those on the banking side, a good way to describe that would be a good trader does not make a good risk manager, and a good risk manager does not make a good trader. Like, these are two distinct disciplines that do take different mindsets, even though the subject matter, they have to be experts in kind of the same subject matter. And in the trading context, we've kind of learned this the hard way over like many years. And so it's pretty familiar. There's a language, there's a grammar to it. With AI, it's a bit of a jumble. And I think that's the really hard part, is that, to your point, Jason, like, especially to a regulator, it's not clear who has the right, it's just in talking to somebody, who has the right mindset and the right capabilities to have which role. Whereas in other, like in commercial lending and trading, a good examiner within 5 minutes can say, this is a risk manager or not. With AI, it's not clear. And I think that does take a bit of work by the community to kind of to suss this out and to figure out, like, are they on the trust engineering side, or are they on the building side? Not that there's anything good or bad with that. It's just being able to distinguish is something we're going to have to develop.
I think that's also the reason why, when the sort of AI governance role emerged, a lot of organizations were uncertain of like what backgrounds they should be hiring for. I've definitely been in conversations where it's been like, oh, should this person be a policy person? Should this person be a technical evals person? Should this person, just generally understand change management? And so I think it's like, it's been hard because the answer is yes to everything, but then that unicorn doesn't exist. So it's probably a combination of all of the above. I guess there was a conversation, and I think Jason, you had brought it up in the past, and I think everyone will have a point of view on this. Mike, especially you, but also Jason and Bo from like PAI, etc. work. There've been conversations around, sort of the existence of, like, of course, we've known about data sheets, data cards, model cards, etc. in the past, nutrition labels. And now there is a conversation on standards. There are a lot of different bodies that are coming up with different kinds of standards, and including both the regulatory body, policy, consortiums, etc., etc. Also including, I live in SF, so including startups as well, right? So this is a very broad question. Are standards helpful? If yes, then what kind? And then second, how should we navigate this sort of world of like abundance of different kind, or is there a specific kind of approach to building these industry standards?
Maybe I'll start. Standards are definitely helpful. The regulator persona here, and it's because it helps with trust. Like, I think it's really helpful. Like, if you go back, one of the very first standards that was ever invented was the kilogram. And it was invented during the French Revolution because people were getting screwed on bread, right? Bakers were just using less and less flour to sell bread, and people were starving. And they're like, wait a second, how do I know I'm getting what I paid for? And so it forced the French government to have a standardized measurement weight to say, you, baker, are selling X amount of bread, and people can trust that and not riot and chop people's heads off. So that's a bit dramatic, but I think it's a nice way of illustrating. Without that, you just don't know. Like, you're going to be using something, you're like, oh, I think this works because it scored well on SWE-bench, and then it destroys your database. You're like, wait a second, like that. So without that certainty, it's a very hard world to scale anything. And I think we're interested in taking things that we can develop and scaling them, especially when it comes to people's money, which is that's something that's kind of near and dear to all of our hearts. So now there's a wide range of different kinds of standards. And I think that's part of the conversation now, is that this is not going to be a top-down process. I think this is going to be quite a bit of bottoms up, where there's going to be a bit of experimentation and a bit of development and kind of finding where that balance point is of something that can be developed, that's credible, that's useful, and that can be used by a wide audience. And I turn to others because this is not going to come from the government. I think this is going to be developed probably through either at best public-private, and really kind of industry groups kind of coming together and saying, hey, we really think that this is what's needed for the industry.
Yeah, I guess what I would add here is I've been on standards authoring bodies before. I've worked in governments. I've worked on policy and law before, and I've been on the receiving end of both of these things before. And I mean, I guess it's obvious that each of these things has a role to play. The question is really not, are standards a good thing or not? It's what's the right grain, what's the right level at which these things are pitched and authored. Is it over prescriptive? Because whether it's voluntary or mandatory, in both cases, if it's overly prescriptive about something that's poorly understood or fast changing, this can be wrong, right? So the fact that it's like an ISO standard or something coming out of NIST, if it's poorly pitched at the wrong level, it kind of doesn't matter. It's not going to be helpful, or it's going to be potentially destructive. So I think the key question is really what's the right level, as opposed to should we or should we not have standards. It's how do you provide standardized recommendations that will be adopted to an industry that's moving at the speed of light and where people don't agree on best practices and things like that. I think rather than trying to fiddle over very specific methodologies, approaches where that focus on the presence or absence of very specific kinds of processes, and the presence of bodies within organizations comprised of certain sets of skills or persons or something like that, and their relationship to builders, how much independence is there. Those kinds of things I think are much easier to get right than you must do this kind of test at this level of this kind of cadence on this very specific definition of what a system is, because each of these things is moving so quickly that it's possible to author a set of guidelines that are actually not going to be actionable, not going to be useful, or they're going to lead people to do evaluations that are actually poor practice at the end of the day. So it's difficult to put into words because I don't feel like I have a great grasp of it, but there's the question of what the grain is, and the speed, velocity, and the just absolute breakneck speed of change makes it very difficult to get that right. But without getting it right, I think whether it's mandatory or voluntary, anything like this is kind of immaterial. It's you need to be able to identify where the right level of action is.
The thing too about standard, and is on the same point, right? Like, they're like, and I so feel both sides of this, how helpful they are, but also like how like wrong it can go. And so under how helpful it is, like, when we understand the shape of what good looks like and what is considered a best practice, and there's some sense of repeatability, right? I'm speaking from the inside as well, like like the effective challenge piece of the puzzle, when it's straightforward and you can on good grounds say, hey, you've deviated from best practices here. And when I say you've deviated from best practices, I stand on firm grounds. I can point to specifically what the best practices look like, and then standards can be part of this. You can also have informal convergence. There's lots of practices, like I would say, like when it comes to modeling inside of banks that have more a shape of like, well, this is kind of how the industry does it, right? But yeah, so like there's a piece of the, same as for regulators, I would say, like from an effective challenge perspective, being able to say, hey, you've deviated from best practice, when that's clear, that helps. The flip side of this is, it can also become a checkbox exercise, and that's like kind of like, like when the measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. There's like this push and pull, right? Clarity in terms of what we all think best practice is can also make us overly comfortable with the fact that I know this is a best practice, therefore I know this can be trusted. And I'm reminded, I don't know, I keep thinking back about those examples. I was doing a research project on generative AI red teaming, where part of what we were interested in doing is going beyond the kind of turf wars people were caught in, where the security people were saying, folks, you're calling this red teaming, but you're just doing basic testing. And we know so well as security professionals that basic testing is important. But please keep in mind, basic testing is never enough. That's why you need a special word called red teaming. And they were concerned that in the Gen AI space, people were just calling basic testing red teaming, which left no question in their minds as to whether the basic testing is good enough. So, but a lesson from security folks for me was, and it just like, yeah, again, like it's seared in my brain from this report we did, and Jake Metcalf, you're in the room, we worked on this together. Security folks kept telling us, we've had to relearn these lessons from the safety engineering folks who in the 80s started worrying about accidents happening when best practices had been fully followed. You follow all your best practices to a T and you nevertheless have very consequential accidents. Where's the problem then? What do you do then, right? And that's the push and pull. Yeah.
I think that's a great point, because it's I mean, two things that you brought up. One is the best risk managers are basically paranoid all the time. Like it's like a good people. Whenever I used to go to conferences and stuff, they say like, "What keeps you up at night?" I'm like, "Everything." Like that's kind of the role of the regulators, to be perpetually scared of everything, in a healthy way. Though it's not to do it so you're fearful of walking outside your door, but it's just to be aware, to be on the balls of your feet, because you constantly, if you're not on the balls of your feet, then you're complacent. Like it's a very binary state. And so I think that's a great highlight point. The other is Goodhart's Law. When you mentioned Goodhart's Law, like the regulatory arbitrage and reward hacking are exactly the same. right? It's the same underlying dynamic where there's a rule and people will say, hey, I want to optimize to that rule, even if it means going against the spirit of what that rule is trying to do, because no one's going to check and I'm going to make money. And so you look at the London whale for JP Morgan Chase when they lost $6 billion, classic, right? Keep RWA constant, increase profits. And they did it by increasing risk in this way that wasn't measured. It's exactly the same as reward hacking and gaming specification. And so I think financial supervision and agent behavior controls have something they can learn from each other on these things. It's kind of fun to think through conceptually and then hard to operationalize. But I think that's why talks like this are quite useful.
Awesome. I know we're close to time. I wanted to leave some time for questions, but I want to ask one question, which is, typically these panels that we do via Xoogler's is, for entrepreneurs / people who want to become entrepreneurs in the future. What should entrepreneurs who want to either build for regulated industries, either in risk or not in risk, what's your advice for them in terms of what they should be building or how they should be thinking about serving these industries? So open to everyone. So whoever wants to go first.
I can jump in with something that, I feel like, Jason, we kind of like bonded over this when we first met in November, where this interface between the engineering and the risk analysis and risk modeling. And one component of the conversation is kind of like the backstory for a lot of the panel, right? Is like how much the regulatory environment is changing, how much the internal risk management environment is changing. We're dealing with change management, like kind of like at every layer. And for me, this makes the question for startups in this space, and this is always like a problem and something to keep in mind, are you taking off-the-shelf assumptions about risk and operationalizing that in your solution? Hopefully not, right? You want the fit between the actual risks and your solution to be really good. But then my question, and it's in this environment where we know so many components are changing, is like, as a startup, what is your strategy? And you're doing well when you can like execute on this for making sure the fit is good. Where does that sit? Where does that live? Does it live inside of options you're giving the organization you're selling to? Do you want configurability? Do you want to have a very proactive hands-on relationship with the people you're selling to help do the customization so that the risk assumptions and the solution are fit for purpose in this deployment context? Or do you want it to be prepackaged? Do you want, as a company, knowing that there's so much that's in flux, do you feel like that's your competitive edge to, be able on your own to make sure the fit is good enough and hand customers something where they can trust that the assumptions and the execution are well aligned? What's your strategy to make sure that joint between risk assumptions and the tooling, is strong despite all the changes?
Mike? No.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Go ahead,
Jason.
Jay.
Oh, Jason, you froze for me.
Yeah.
Oh, no, you're back. Okay, sorry.
So I guess super quickly, two things that I would say is the first is to help the ecosystem move beyond theater. I think a lot of the observability tooling and evaluation tooling that we have in place today produces a lot of numbers. The meaning of those numbers highly questionable. Not everything, obviously, some are better than others, but like there's an awful lot out there that produces numbers and that people put on cards or put on reports and put before decision makers. But if you push them, they're like strings hanging, and there's not a lot of substance behind them because in large part because the risk modeling and threat modeling piece is not done well, and the evaluations are not built with that in mind. So I think there's a set of tooling to, first of all, help people who are now presented with needing to govern these very complex systems being deployed into situations where those systems were not evaluated well, to understand what the actual risk landscape and threat landscape looks like given the thing that they want to deploy and given their production environment. This is a very difficult task for security teams who have a lot of history doing threat modeling. I've been in a number of those processes, watched how it happens. I think there's a lot to learn, but there's also a lot to think about how we can build technology around that process to automate it, scale it, have, assist humans doing it at much greater scale and speed. Because now we're deploying these kinds of systems in the thousands, tens of thousands, and they're sort of learning and evolving at runtime, and so themselves are constantly changing. And so, threat and risk modeling needs to become something that's kind of a core part of how a platform or deployment space works, and it has to be done at machine scale or agent scale and speed. Which doesn't mean removing humans from the exercise. It just means that there's a lot of tooling to do good threat and risk modeling well, as an input to doing stronger evaluation. But that piece to me feels like very blue ocean kind of space right now. And the second is to think about auditors and the audit function as first-class personas to build products around. And not just assume that if something has been evaluated and there's stuff in a model card that the things are ready to be evaluated. As agents go through these long trajectories, multi-step trajectories, they're emitting crazy amounts of data, or could be, and the environment is constantly evolving around them. All of these things together create the behavioral, the reason for the behavioral profile, and also the potential off-ramps and alternative paths that were available to an agent. And without all that information structured in a good way, you can't really understand why an agent took the path it took, and what alternatives were available to it, and why it reasoned about taking one path versus another path. There's an awful lot to be done there to think about how to structure, store, make accessible, surface the right kind of information to the audit function internally or externally. And I think that's like a very underserved market right now. A lot of what's being given to that function is what I would think of as kind of the output of theater today. It's like a bunch of numbers. But it's not a robust representation of like what actually happened, so that they can do the job of auditing in a good way.
Maybe one last thing to add, because I strongly agree with what Jason and Florian just said. To understand the mind, if you're going to be a startup in the GRC space and financial services, I think it helps to understand the mindset and the pressure that the examiners are under. And the reason is that the regulators, when something goes wrong, regulators get hauled up in front of Congress and have to explain it. This is not fun. Like, I've had to do this. And sometimes you do it with the cameras on, and sometimes it's even worse when the cameras are off. It is a very, very unpleasant experience to say, oh, this thing at Silicon Valley Bank, or this thing that whatever happened. And then because the questions are, how come you didn't stop it? How come you didn't see it? It's so obvious now. Like, you get this whole set of things. And that's part of the theater. But the theater is interesting because the politicians have to explain it to their constituents. So I don't entirely blame the politicians for doing this, because at the end of the day, people are like, how could that go wrong? And I think this is part of the building trust space, is that you can't make everything perfect. But you can make things so that when things do go wrong, you can identify why and you can fix it. That's really critical, because if you are able to do that, you can earn trust. But too often something goes wrong and everyone's pointing at somebody else, and it's like a scramble of throwing somebody under the bus. Like, you get all these kind of pathologies that come with that, which are very unhealthy. And I always liked, when the NTSB, when there's like a plane crash, the process around understanding what caused the plane crash, they actually start with a very blameless, like, they're not looking to blame somebody. They actually want to understand what happened. And they understand, like, part of it's going to be engineering. A lot of it's going to be humans. A lot of it's going to be just the alignment of things that people didn't think would align that happens. That's a productive, healthy, constructive way. And if you can kind of demonstrate that in some way, regulators can pick up on that. Compliance officers can pick up on it. Like, that's a very powerful trait. I can't like list out what the factors are. It's almost like a spidey sense that people who are in that field have. And if you have that, that can cut through the performance of, like, here's 20 dashboards that, everyone's seen 1,000 times. Like, that's not going to convince. It's that other missing factor, which I think is comes through in the work. Like, people who put the work into that, it shows. And so, like, do that work, I guess is my suggestion, and let that show. And don't don't try to oversell it. Like just sell the thing that you did. And I think is hopefully is the right answer.
That is phenomenal advice from all of you. I will open it up for questions. There were more questions we wanted to go through, but I know we have less time. So if anyone in the group has a question, you can raise your hand and ask, or type it in chat, although it might be faster to just ask directly. Any questions? Any comments on open weight versus proprietary models?
It's a pretty open-ended question.
Claire, do you want to ask if there is a question around specifically what around open weight versus proprietary?
I almost tickled to jump in with a slightly different answer than what the person is asking for, but I think it's related. We've been talking about agents, we've been talking about harnesses. I think, one of the, and I'll speak for myself, I've made that mistake before. So I've mentioned how in the Partnership on AI working group, to focus a lot of the conversation for uses of agents in financial sector is on narrow purpose agents. In 2026, only looking at narrow purpose and not thinking through what is happening with the very, very powerful, very, very effective general purpose harnesses, under what circumstances do you want to use them, but also what does it look like for banks to get serious about this is important. It's noteworthy too, to me, I feel like the, Singapore government's, the IMDA, I always forget what it stands for, they've been putting out really good, early, examples of thinking through what good risk management for agents looks like. And one of their first case studies published as a standalone thing is about OpenClaw. And they're like, here's guidance for how to think through adopting OpenClaw, coming from a government, right? That's a question I think people, are definitely thinking through and is interesting and worth thinking through. It's not the same as the open weight versus proprietary model question, but I think it's another 2026 favorite question that should be on people's mind. And I'm curious to see how that space evolves in banks.
We have a bunch of questions, so we'll have to sprint answer these. I'll go to the next one, which is, maybe already covered that, but how do you see the role of MRM in financial institutions in this new era? Anyone wants to take that?
My guess is that there's going to be a traditional MRM function, which is going to continue just as it has for the vast majority of models at banks, and that the MRM related to AI will eventually morph into kind of just an AI risk management more broadly. And that the names and the titles, it's funny, there's some academics I've been working with who talk about, they call it adapted MRM for AI, but internally they're like, yeah, but it's pretty different. So they recognize that it's the components are and the mindset is quite different. It's just familiar. It's a familiar concept to regulators. And so it's almost like a safety blanket. There's some comfort in hanging on to that because it's familiar. But I think it will be eventually be replaced by something that's more kind of directly fit for purpose for AI is my guess. I'm outside financial services. We interact with financial services, organizations that are our customers, but not on usually mission critical things, more on back office type things. So I guess my initial reaction to this is that inside, I've never worked in a bank, but I guess I know from the outside and listening to you guys that in addition to MRM, you have lots of other risk functions inside banks. And arguably your investment groups are themselves, or your traders are doing their own version of risk analysis because they're trying to understand, effectively, this is the underbelly of what could go wrong with my trade. And so a lot of people are thinking about risk in one shape or form. Inside most other organizations, this is really not the case, right? And so you see groups starting to build what they refer to as AI control groups or AI governance groups. And what I see is there's this big gap that opens up because and it's the same kind of gap that
I think exists between what classically inside organizations, you had groups that were in charge of, or governing your individual employees. They they were like badges and credentials and other resources, and whether or not you should have permission to do this or that, those kinds of things. And that's very different from, say, governance of work objects or work that gets done inside the organization. What's the workflow, the procedure, what kind of review needs to be present for this work object to be deemed authorized and acceptable before it passes to another gate, and these kinds of things. So that's a governance of an object, like a work object, or a bit of value that an organization creates. Different. And so now we're building these AI governance groups, and what they're doing effectively is trying to think about the actor of an agent. What governance needs to be put around an agent to make it, to have it be so-called governable. But in the meantime, what's happening is that work objects, like the value units and the process that objects go through to create value for an organization, are being fundamentally altered as agents do more and more different parts of this work, and humans, even if they're still involved, they're doing different portions of it. Those traditional work governance processes were designed for humans, and the humans that fail in very specific ways and have certain volume of output and so on. And so now all of this is being put under stress, and there's not, I think there's this big gap. We're thinking about governing AI as governing the individual entity of the agent, and forgetting that everything else about how we govern organizations is now fundamentally changing. And if those are not AI infused in some way, if everything needs to change in an era where AI is now doing many things, not just we need this new MRM group that translates to a new generative AI or agentic era. So I think that's a really big gap. And I think there's all sorts of opportunities for people interested in working on companies around the governance of work in an era when agents do more of the work. Because I've written about this publicly, I think it's just like a big missing, it's a big blind spot in the community around AI governance.
That is a great point. I know we're at time, so I'm really sorry, Ankit and Delizo, we were not able to get to your questions. But lesson learned. Next time I'll open up for panels a little earlier. But feel free to email us if there are any pressing questions that we can help with. My email at least would be on the calendar invite on Key. But thank you so much for joining, Bo, Mike, Jason. I learned a lot, and like I said, this video is going to be up on YouTube. I'll share it separately as well, so feel free to share it with other colleagues of yours and friends who might benefit from this.
Thanks so much.
Everyone. Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.